Hi guys, it's Mrs. Clark. Today we are going to start our first lesson on Unit 2, Fraction and Decimal Number Sense. Now before we get started, I want to make sure you're ready. Make sure you have your math notebook and any notes you are going to need for this video. Make sure that you are focused and I have your full attention. If so, let's get started. Today we are going to do lesson 1, which is relating or naming fractions and decimals, and we're going to talk about the equivalent fraction and decimal names. So by the end of this video, you will be able to name fractions and their equivalent decimal form, and the reverse, name decimals and their equivalent fraction form. You will be able to recognize pictorial representations or recognize pictures of fractions and decimals, and you will be able to relate decimals and mixed numbers together. So let's start by thinking back to the last time you used these math tools. They should be familiar. We have a hundreds flat, some 10 sticks, and some ones cubes. And if you remember, these math manipulatives represented whole numbers. They were numbers greater than 0. So the number I have shown here is 138, 100, 3 tens, and 8 ones. But did you know that there are actually numbers to the right of the last 0? We can add what's called a decimal point, and we can add numbers beyond the decimal point to the right of this number. And those numbers are actually going to be the decimals and fractions that we look at today. And those numbers are less than 1. So let's pretend that we have a number line, as you can see on the screen. Now, number lines, because they have arrows, go on forever in both directions, both the left and the right, meaning there are numbers on this number line greater than 10 and numbers on this number line that are less than 1. We, for the purpose of decimals and fractions, are going to zoom in on this number line between the 0 and the 1. And I am going to put a red box around it so you can see what I'm talking about. And this is going to be the area that we are going to primarily focus on when naming today's decimals and fractions. So imagine this number line and we zoom in super close just between the 0 and the 1 space, and that is where we are going to hang out today. So remember that hundreds flat from before that we looked at. I want you to remember this hundreds flat, but I want to think about it in a different way. So I want you to imagine it's actually one of those little ones cubes zoomed in super close and then cut apart into 100 different boxes. So this 100s flat no longer means 100. I want you to imagine it being one whole. It is that orange ones cube zoomed in super close, and then we drew all these lines on it. So it means 1. Keep that in mind. So let's take a look at place value before we move forward and see what we remember. There's lots of names for the digits and where they are in the place of a number. So just like we think about math tools in a new way, we're going to examine place value in a slightly different way than you did before. Now, you should be familiar with the ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, those places, and so on. But for the focus of today's lesson, I want you to notice that we now have a decimal point. And to the right of that decimal point, we have new places. We have the 10th place, the 100th place, the 1000th place, and the 10,000th place. I want you to notice that at the end of these words, they have a THS. That's how we pronounce it, and that's how we spell it. And I want you to also notice that many of these place values mirror the place values to the left of the decimal point, with the exception of the ones place. There's no once place. It's the 10th place. And the 100th place sounds like the hundreds place. So it helps us remember those places a little bit easier. Make a special note that when we say the decimal point in a number, it stands for the word and. So let's take a look at that hundreds flat that we're imagining is actually a ones cube, remember. So each long row is going to be equal to 1/10 because there are 10 rows and 10 columns. So I can highlight one column here, and this means 1/10, or I could reverse the column and do it horizontally. It means the same, 1/10. And this is how I would represent this number as both a decimal and a fraction. Notice that when I write it as a decimal, I put the 1 in the 10th place, and I would read that decimal as 1/10. When I write this number as a fraction, I write it 1/10. 1 as a numerator, 10 as the denominator, because I have one piece out of 10 total pieces. I also included that number line for us on this slide, and I want you to notice that between my 0 and 1, we've divided that section into 10 little parts, tenths, and my dot is located where my 1/10 decimal or fraction would be located on this number line. Now, how would we name this decimal or fraction? Remember, we just did tenths place, and I want you to notice how many columns are colored. Hopefully you're saying that there's 4 columns colored, and so we would represent this fraction or decimal as 4/10 because I have 4 out of 10 pieces colored. I write the 4 in the 10th place and also indicate it as the numerator in my fraction. Follow along with that pink dot as it travels along the number line. It's now placed in the correct spot to represent 4/10 on my number line. All right, let's look at a new one. This is a new hundreds flat. Remember, it means 1. And each of those little boxes now is going to be a hundredth. We're moving on. So it's called 100 because there are 100 little boxes on this square. So this is 1/100th. And we would write this decimal and fraction this way. I would now put the 1 in the hundredths place. Notice there's a 0 in the tenths place because I don't have any tenths, but I put the 1 in the hundredths place because I have 1/100th. And I write that as a fraction with 1 as the numerator and 100 as the denominator. So 1/100th. And the pink dot on my number line is super close to the 0 because I only have 1 small hundredth colored in that entire 1. All right, what about this one? I have 4 boxes colored, 4 small boxes. Do you remember what those boxes were called? Hopefully you're telling me that those boxes are called hundredths and I have 4 of them. So now I just move my 4 over to the hundredths place and I write my fraction with 4 in the numerator place, 4/100ths, and I could indicate that on my number line as 4/100ths. Notice it didn't move a lot from the 1/100th place it was before because I still have only colored a very small part of this whole. I'm not getting very close to coloring the entire square in, so I can't yet say I'm getting close to 1 whole. What about this one? I kind of mixed them together. Now you should be saying, well, I see a tenth and I also see hundredths, so how do I write this decimal and fraction? Well, I'm glad you noticed that we have decimals. We have tenths and hundredths in this decimal. So if you notice, we have a 1 in the tenths place because I have 1/10, and I have a 3 in the hundredths place because I have 3/100ths. So I actually have 13 boxes colored. So I can make sure that when I write the number 13, the 3, the last digit, is in the hundredths place. So this is 13 over 100, or 13/100ths. And you can see I wrote it there as a fraction, and my pink dot is moving along my number line because we are getting closer to coloring in 1 whole. What about these fractions and decimals? Can you name these? Notice that the blue covers half of the square. And any way I put it, vertically or horizontally, it's covering half of the square. So this fraction would actually be 1/2. I colored half of my square. And I want you to notice that when I write it as a decimal, it's written as 0.5. 5/10, because if you look closely, I've colored in 5 rows or 5 columns of tenths. So I actually have 5/10, also 50/100ths. So all 3 of those numbers are the same. 5/10 is the same thing as 50/100ths is the same thing as 1/2. What about now? What do you notice? I've colored in 1/4 of my square this time, or 25 individual hundredth boxes. So you can notice that when I write this number as a decimal, it's written as 0.25 because I colored in 25 hundredths. And I also, if I section my square into fourths, you'll notice that I colored in 1/4 of my square. So 1/4 is the same thing as 25 hundredths. And I put a dollar sign when I wrote this decimal because isn't that what decimals are? Decimals are money. If you think about money, you already know how to do decimals. And I like to remember that 25 hundredths is the same thing as 1/4 because 25 hundredths is the same thing as 25 cents, right? Isn't a quarter worth 25 cents? And doesn't 4 quarters make up $1 or 1 whole? It's an easy way to remember that 0.25 is the same thing as 1/4. All right, here's another one. How many tenths did I cover? So there are 2 columns covered here. So this is 2 tenths, or 20 total boxes, so 20 over 100. And if I section section this square apart again, you can see that I actually colored 1/5 of the entire whole. So 0.2 or 2/10 and 0.20 or 20 hundredths is the same thing as 1/5. Let's take a look at two more decimal fraction combinations, and we're going to look at some slightly different pictures with these two. Another decimal fraction combination you need to know is 1/8. And I've showed it drawn here two ways, with a circle and a rectangle. You can notice that 8 is the denominator because there are 8 total pieces, and I colored one piece, which gives me my fraction of 1/8. 1/8 of a whole, or 1 out of 8 total pieces. And you just have to remember that 0.125 or 125 thousandths is the same thing as my 1/8 as a fraction. If I turn 1/8 as my fraction into my decimal, I would get 125 thousandths. All right, one more. Here we have 1/3. 1 out of 3 total pieces drawn as a circle and drawn as a square or rectangle. If I turn 1/3, my fraction, into a decimal, it would be 33 hundredths with that little line over the top. That means repeating. We're going to get more to that in another lesson. But for now, I want you to remember that 1/3 is 33 hundredths repeating. All right, one more thing for today, mixed numbers. A mixed number has a part that is a whole and a part that is a fraction. It's like combining whole numbers with fractions or decimals. So let's take a look at a couple. We can represent it both ways. So here is my mixed number as a fraction. I have one whole circle colored. You can see that there in the pink. And then I have a second circle where only 3/4 of the circle is colored. So if I put these two pictures together, I have one whole and 3/4. So that can be represented as the mixed number 1 3/4. What does it look like as a decimal? So here again, two pictures. I have one whole colored, you can see that with the red, and then I have 4/10 colored in the next shape. So if I put my one whole together with my 4/10, I can represent this as a decimal as well. And I would say it is 1 4/10 with the decimal in between my two numbers there. All right, guys, that's it for today's lesson. Today we explored fractions and decimals. We learned how to write fractions and write decimals, and we learned what fractions were equal to which decimals and vice versa. We also looked at what decimals and fractions look like through pictures, and we explored some mixed numbers and how to write mixed numbers as fractions and decimals. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. I'll see you guys in the next video.